The Harrington mansion was silent, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. Edward stood by the window, the serpent coin cold in his palm, while the files, their only weapon, lay spread across the desk like a confession waiting to be signed. At dawn, reporters swarmed outside the gates, sensing something monumental. Drones buzzed overhead, cameras hungry for blood. The world was watching. Edward, flanked by Isabella, Adrian, and a pale but unbroken Charlotte, stepped out onto the balcony. His voice, once dripping with arrogance, was heavy but clear. For decades we built an empire. But what the world saw was only gold on the surface. Beneath it was rot. We dealt with devils, and now the devils have come to collect. If I fall, let it be known, I do not fall alone. The serpent falls with me. He lifted the files high. Cameras flashed like lightning. Within minutes, the evidence was everywhere, online, on the evening news, in the hands of investigators. Names, crimes, blood, money. The serpent had been exposed. But the price was immediate. From the crowd, a single shot cracked like thunder. Edward staggered, crimson blooming across his chest. Isabella screamed. Adrian caught him before he collapsed, while Charlotte stood frozen, her eyes burning with something between horror and fury. The world gasped, not at the death of a millionaire, but at the revelation of what his dynasty truly was. By nightfall, the Harrington Empire was ashes. Their wealth gone, their influence shattered. Yet the serpent's grip on London, too, had fractured under the weight of Edward's final act. And in the silence of their once magnificent halls, Charlotte whispered, "We are no longer kings of gold, but perhaps, at last, we are free." For the first time in weeks, the Harringtons stopped waiting for the serpent to make the next move. Desperation forced them to act. Edward summoned his family to the study, the heavy curtains drawn, candlelight flickering against the mahogany walls. His voice was low but steady. "We cannot buy our way out. We cannot beg our way out. The only chance we have is to fight." Adrian slammed his fist on the desk. "Fight? With what? They own the police, the press, the city." Edward leaned forward, his eyes burning with the spark of the man he once was. "Not the city, Adrian. Us. We still have one thing left, our truth." He revealed a set of hidden files, documents he had kept locked away for decades. Proof of the serpent's crimes, money laundering, blackmail, even murders buried under forged contracts. If these files reached the right hands, the serpent's empire could crumble. But releasing them meant confessing his own sins too. Isabella's voice cracked with fear. "If you do this, Edward, we lose everything that's left. Our name. Our safety. Perhaps even our lives." Charlotte's voice came from the corner of the room, steady despite her trauma. "We've already lost everything. What's left is survival, or revenge." The family stared at the files, the weight of their legacy pressed into each sheet of paper. The decision was no longer about wealth or pride. It was about ending the nightmare, or letting it consume them all. And as the mansion shook with the chants of the mob outside, Edward placed the files on the desk. "Tomorrow," he said grimly, "the world will know the truth." The Harringtons had always believed that wealth could buy them out of any nightmare. But now, as their fortune evaporated and their enemies struck at their blood, the illusion shattered. Edward sat alone in his study, staring at the serpent coin that had arrived in the red envelope. Once, he had believed it was just a threat. Now he understood. It was a signature, a declaration that every step of their downfall had been orchestrated. Adrian returned from a failed rescue attempt, his hands bruised, his eyes hollow. His loyal friends had abandoned him after the serpent's men ambushed them. "We can't win," he muttered, collapsing into a chair. "They control everything." Isabella no longer spoke of restoring their name. She moved like a ghost through the halls, whispering prayers to portraits of ancestors who had once walked these rooms in glory. At night, she cried into her hands, the diamonds on her fingers dull without the power that once made them shine. And Charlotte? Her videos continued to appear online, each one crueler than the last. The public no longer watched out of outrage but for entertainment. Their daughter had become a spectacle, a twisted reality show staged by the serpent. That evening, the family gathered for what felt like the last time at their long dining table. For once, they were united in silence. The chandeliers no longer sparkled, the silverware no longer gleamed. Only Edward's voice broke the stillness. "We thought we were untouchable. But everything we had was built on lies. And now, all we can do is survive the truth." The Harringtons had finally reached their breaking point. And survival, not wealth, was now the only prize worth fighting for. The Harringtons had been humiliated, stripped of power, and now one of their own was in enemy hands. The gilded facade of their lives was gone. What remained was desperation. Edward moved quickly, summoning contacts he hadn't spoken to in decades. Old business partners, lawyers, even a few politicians who still owed him favors. But most refused his calls, unwilling to tie their names to a family already drowning. The serpent's influence reached further than he feared. Adrian, hot-blooded and reckless, went another way. He gathered a small group of loyal friends from London's underworld, men who owed him debts from gambling tables and nightclub favors. "We're getting Charlotte back," he swore, rage blazing in his eyes. But rage is blind, and the serpent fed on recklessness. Meanwhile, Isabella sat silently in her dressing room, staring at old photographs of their family smiling at charity events, of children's laughter frozen in time. She whispered through tears, "We're being punished for sins we never confessed. And Charlotte?" Still bound in the warehouse, she showed no fear. In the darkness, she mocked her captors, calling them cowards. But the camera caught everything, and her words were broadcast to the world. Instead of sympathy, the public mocked her arrogance, turning her suffering into entertainment. Then, one night, as Edward prepared for a desperate negotiation, a new video appeared online. This time, Charlotte wasn't alone. Another figure was dragged into the frame, beaten, bloodied. Adrian's closest friend. The masked voice declared, "Every move you make has a price. Pay with money, or pay with blood." The Harringtons had tried to fight back. And now the serpent tightened its coils. The warning had been clear. The Harringtons should have tightened their defenses, but arrogance and denial blinded them. The strike came fast, brutal, and undeniable. It was Charlotte. She had left the mansion in defiance, sneaking out in the early hours for a party. At dawn, the Harringtons' phones rang, not from her, but from an unknown number. When Edward answered, the line was silent at first. Then came a voice, deep and deliberate. "We warned you. Now she is ours." A scream echoed faintly through the line before it went dead. Panic erupted inside the mansion. Isabella collapsed, sobbing uncontrollably. Adrian stormed out, threatening to tear the city apart brick by brick to find his sister. Edward, pale as marble, gripped the serpent coin left on the dining table. Their enemies had walked into their home again, unseen. Hours later, a video appeared online. Charlotte, bound to a chair in a dim warehouse, her face bruised but defiant, stared into the camera. Behind her, the serpent emblem hung on the wall. A masked figure's voice filled the silence. "The Harringtons built their empire on betrayal. Now they will pay. Unless Edward confesses the truth, piece by piece, London will watch his dynasty burn to the ground, starting with his daughter." The city, already hungry for scandal, erupted. The Harrington downfall had moved from headlines to horror. And the serpent had just claimed its first victim. The Harringtons had lost their fortune, their influence, and their reputation. But now the war grew personal. One evening, as Isabella returned from a futile attempt to salvage her charity work, she found the mansion's front gates pried open. On the cobblestone drive lay a blood-red envelope addressed to her in looping handwriting. Inside was a single photograph, Charlotte, taken only hours earlier, laughing with friends at a private club. The message scrawled on the back froze Isabella's heart. "We can take her any time we want." Panic spread like wildfire. Edward tried to hide the photo, but Charlotte snatched it from his hands, her smirk vanishing for the first time. Adrian cursed, demanding more guards, more protection, but Edward's voice cut him down. No amount of guards can stop them. They've already marked us. That night, the family gathered in the once proud dining hall, its chandeliers now dim. Every word was sharp, every glance filled with fear. For the first time, Isabella's composure shattered. They don't just want money, Edward. They want to destroy us, piece by piece. And she was right. Across the city, their enemies smiled in the shadows. It was no longer about debts or scandal. It was about revenge. The Harringtons weren't just falling. They were being hunted. By the end of the week, the Harringtons were no longer London's royal family of wealth. They were its public spectacle. Television stations broadcast live footage of angry crowds gathering outside their mansion. Protesters carried placards with words like, "Thieves in suits," and "Blood Money Empire." Once loyal employees stepped forward with damning testimonies, painting Edward as a tyrant who silenced rivals and manipulated markets. The Harrington children weren't spared either. Adrian's scandals filled the tabloids daily, from gambling debts to whispers of affairs with married socialites. Charlotte, once a fashion darling, was caught on camera mocking reporters while drunk, her smirk splashed across front pages with the headline, "The Princess of Arrogance." The final blow came when the Prime Minister himself addressed Parliament. Though he didn't name Edward directly, his words carried a blade's edge. No family, no matter how wealthy, is above the law. Justice will come for those who believe they can build empires on corruption. The Harrington mansion, once a symbol of untouchable prestige, became a prison of shame. Isabella refused to leave her room, curtains drawn tight. Adrian raged, drinking himself into stupor. Charlotte drifted through the chaos like an actress enjoying the tragedy of her own play. But Edward knew this wasn't just the public turning against them. The serpent in the shadows had orchestrated this perfectly, dragging every secret into the light. That night, he looked out the window at the mob, their chants echoing in the cold London air. For the first time in his life, the great Edward Harrington whispered words he had never dared before. "We are finished." And yet, the serpent wasn't done with them. London's nights grew colder, but the Harringtons barely noticed. Their mansion had become a gilded cage, surrounded not just by paparazzi but by figures far more menacing. It began subtly. Edward's closest allies, bankers, politicians, even old friends, stopped returning calls. Isabella's charity galas were suddenly cancelled, donors vanishing overnight. And then the first real strike came. A convoy of Harrington luxury cars parked in their private garage was set ablaze. Flames tore through the night sky, the serpent emblem spray-painted on the garage door before the fire consumed it. The message was undeniable. The past had come to collect. Police arrived, but their presence only fueled the chaos. Neighbors whispered, reporters shouted, and the Harrington name, once a badge of prestige, became a symbol of scandal and danger. Inside the mansion, tension cracked like thunder. Adrian roared at his father, slamming his fists against the marble table. "You brought this on us!" "They're not after the company, they're after us." Edward stared back, his voice low and hollow. "I thought I could bury the serpent. But you cannot bury what was never dead." Charlotte, watching from the shadows, smiled faintly. Unlike the rest of her family, she seemed almost intoxicated by the danger. "Let them come," she whispered, her cigarette glowing in the dark. "Perhaps we'll finally see who we truly are without the crown of gold." And as smoke from the burned cars drifted into the night sky, a black limousine pulled up a block away. Inside sat a man in a tailored suit, serpent ring glittering under the streetlights. He watched the flames with calm satisfaction. The Harringtons weren't just losing money anymore. They were losing their power. The Harrington mansion no longer bustled with elegance. Reporters camped outside the gates, investors stopped answering calls, and staff began quietly resigning. But the worst was yet to come. A new exposé appeared in The Guardian, not about Adrian or Isabella, but Edward. The article claimed that decades earlier, when Harrington Holdings was still in its infancy, Edward had partnered with dangerous figures from London's underworld. Their money had funded his first investments, money that was never repaid. In return, Edward had allegedly buried their crimes inside the walls of his empire. The piece included damning details, secret meetings in smoke-filled clubs, coded ledgers, even whispers of missing associates. Though Edward denied everything, the evidence was chilling. A grainy photograph surfaced, Edward shaking hands with a man whose face was partially obscured, but whose serpent-shaped ring glinted unmistakably in the light. The city was electrified. Overnight, Edward Harrington transformed from a titan of business into a suspected criminal. Journalists demanded answers. Protesters gathered outside the mansion, chanting for justice. Inside, Isabella confronted him. "Is it true, Edward? Did you build everything on blood money?" For the first time in years, Edward couldn't answer. His silence was deafening. Charlotte watched her father with cold, curious eyes. Unlike Adrian, who raged and panicked, she whispered softly, almost with admiration. "So the rumors were true all along. You played with devils, and now they've come to collect." That night, Edward locked himself in his study, staring at old photographs and hidden files. The serpent emblem had returned to his life with a vengeance. He had known this day would come. He just never thought it would come for his family. The morning after the break-in, the Harringtons awoke not only to fear but to public humiliation. Newspapers and television stations erupted with headlines even more devastating than before. Someone had leaked private photographs, images of Adrian stumbling out of an exclusive club at dawn, disheveled and drunk, with company he shouldn't have been keeping. The media devoured it. "The golden heir in disgrace," the tabloids screamed. Overnight, Adrian became a symbol not of success but of excess. Sponsors cut ties. Investors fled faster. His phone, once filled with eager invitations, now buzzed only with silence. Isabella tried to contain the damage, arranging interviews to present a polished family image. But when she appeared on live television, her carefully rehearsed lines faltered. Reporters bombarded her with questions about Edward's debts, about Adrian's scandals, about the masked intruders rumored to have broken into their estate. Her perfect facade cracked on camera, her voice trembling, her eyes filling with tears. By afternoon, #Harrington Fall was trending across every social platform in London. Their name was no longer tied to power, it was entertainment. People laughed at their downfall, memes spreading like wildfire. In the mansion, Adrian smashed a mirror in fury, his knuckles bleeding. "They've destroyed me!" he screamed. But Edward knew better. "No," he muttered under his breath, staring out at the reporters camped outside their gates. "This is just the beginning." Somewhere in the city, the shadowy figure who had delivered the letter watched the chaos unfold on a television screen, a cruel smile tugging at his lips. The trap was tightening. The Harrington mansion, once a fortress of wealth and elegance, no longer felt safe. Guards had been dismissed weeks earlier to cut costs, leaving only a skeleton staff. That was when the intruders came. It was just past midnight when Charlotte woke to the sound of glass shattering downstairs. She slipped out of bed, her silk gown brushing the floor, and peered over the balcony. Shadows moved swiftly across the marble hall, men in black masks, their footsteps silent but purposeful. Adrian rushed from his room, baseball bat in hand. "Stay back!" he shouted, his voice trembling more than he wanted to admit. One of the intruders turned, flashing a blade in the moonlight. Edward appeared seconds later, clutching his revolver, a relic from his youth. His hand shook as he aimed, torn between fear and rage. "Get out of my house!" he barked. But the men didn't flee. Instead, one of them tossed something across the floor, a small velvet pouch. When Edward opened it, his blood ran cold. Inside was a serpent-shaped coin, the same emblem from the letter's wax seal. This wasn't a burglary. It was a warning. By the time the police arrived, the intruders were gone, leaving shattered glass and rattled nerves behind. But the message was clear: the Harringtons were no longer untouchable. That night, Isabella locked herself in her dressing room, sobbing quietly for the first time in years. Adrian paced like a caged animal. Charlotte, however, lit a cigarette by the broken window, exhaling smoke into the cold London air. "They've finally come for us," she whispered, almost amused. 3 days later, the Harringtons' illusion of invincibility shattered. It began with whispers in the financial world. Stocks in Harrington Holdings, once considered untouchable, plunged overnight. Investors, sensing blood in the water, fled like vultures from a dying beast. Edward's phone buzzed relentlessly, each call another demand, another accusation, another partner pulling out. At breakfast, the atmosphere was no longer just tense, it was suffocating. Adrian slammed his phone down, his jaw clenched. "Father, what's happening? Why are our assets frozen?" Edward's silence spoke louder than any confession. Isabella's hand trembled as she reached for her teacup, porcelain clinking against the saucer. For the first time in years, her perfect mask cracked. That night, the first public strike landed. A rival newspaper splashed a brutal headline across its front page. "London's golden family built on lies? Harrington Empire under fire." The article accused Edward of laundering money, exploiting loopholes, and cozying up to underworld figures. Though much of it was speculation, the damage was irreversible. The Harrington name, once their greatest asset, was now poison. As the scandal spread, cameras appeared outside the mansion gates. Paparazzi shouted questions, their flashes cutting through the night like lightning. From the upstairs window, Charlotte watched the chaos with an unsettling smile. "It's starting," she whispered to herself. The following morning, the Harrington mansion felt different. The air was heavy, the silence oppressive. Edward hadn't slept. The letter haunted him, replaying in his mind like a curse. He sat at the breakfast table, staring blankly at untouched eggs and coffee, his face ashen. Isabella noticed. She always noticed. With a perfect smile painted on her lips, she leaned close and whispered, "You're hiding something again, Edward. Don't let it show." Adrian entered the room, flipping through the morning paper. The headlines praised his speech at the gala, calling him the future of British business. But buried in the financial section was a smaller piece: Harrington Holdings under quiet investigation. Adrian froze, his confident mask slipping. He folded the paper quickly before his mother could see. Meanwhile, Charlotte had returned late from the gardens. She didn't mention the figure at the gates, nor the unease it stirred in her. Instead, she poured herself champagne for breakfast, ignoring her father's glare. She knew something was wrong, and Charlotte thrived on secrets. Upstairs, the staff whispered nervously. They had seen men in dark coats circling the property the night before. One swore he heard footsteps by the garage at 3 a.m. The Harringtons were no longer just admired. They were being watched. And in the city, forces long forgotten were already moving their pieces across the board. Edward Harrington locked himself inside his study, the gala's music muffled by the heavy oak doors. His hands trembled as he unfolded the letter, the wax seal cracking like thunder in his ears. The handwriting was elegant but merciless. "Your debts are no longer ignored. Payment is due. You have 7 days." His pulse quickened. These weren't ordinary debts. They were ghosts from his past, buried under years of deception and financial trickery. The Harrington Empire had been built not only on ambition but also on borrowed favors from men who thrived in the darkness of London's underworld. Men who never forgot. Meanwhile, the gala raged on downstairs. Isabella dazzled the crowd, her laughter masking the cracks forming in her world. Adrian, the heir, toasted champagne with politicians, unaware of the storm about to consume him. Charlotte, restless and reckless, slipped out into the gardens, where a shadowy figure stood at the gates, watching the mansion with unblinking eyes. Edward folded the letter and pressed it to his chest, his mind racing. If the truth came out, it wouldn't just ruin him. It would drag his family's name through fire, turning London's most envied dynasty into its greatest scandal. But the clock was already ticking. London, at the height of its prestige. The Harringtons were no ordinary family. They were the family. Their mansion, a sprawling estate in Mayfair, gleamed with marble floors and crystal chandeliers. Their name was whispered at private clubs, echoed in Parliament's corridors, and splashed across the glossy pages of society magazines. At the center stood Edward Harrington, the patriarch, a man of commanding presence and razor-sharp business acumen. His wife, Isabella, was adored by the media for her elegance and charm, while their children, Adrian and Charlotte, were seen as London's golden youth, heirs to an empire of unimaginable wealth. But behind the champagne smiles and tailored suits, secrets were buried deep. Edward's empire was built on fragile foundations, risky deals, powerful enemies, and whispers of corruption. Yet no one dared challenge the Harringtons. They were untouchable. Or so it seemed. One night, as fireworks lit up the Thames for the family's gala, a spectacle of diamonds, symphonies, and politicians, an uninvited letter slipped under the door changed everything. The wax seal was stamped with a crest Edward hadn't seen in years. His face strained of color as he read the words. The empire wasn't as invincible as the world believed.